William Easton Randolph Byrne, born in 1862, was one of the most fascinating characters West Virginia has ever produced. He was born of a Confederate father and a mother who was sister to a future governor of the state. Well educated and multi-talented, he was at home in most any social setting. He had a common touch, as comfortable with working men as local dignitaries. An accomplished attorney based in Sutton, West Virginia, he practiced law in Braxton, Clay, Nicholas, and Webster counties. He was an experienced surveyor who assisted in unsuccessful attempts to lay railroad tracks in central West Virginia. Politically, he was a lifelong Democrat who served in several offices in the West Virginia state government, including clerk of the Supreme Court of Appeals in 1937. A lifelong angler, he loved nothing more than fishing and gigging on the Elk River in central West Virginia. In his travels, he fished with many of the great West Virginia luminaries of his time, including teacher, banker, and governor William McCorkle, whose ghost reputedly haunts his old mansion, Sunrise, in Charleston, West Virginia; Senator John Kenna, oilman entrepreneur Johnson N. Camden, and even claimed to have seen Senator Henry Gassaway Davis, railroader and vice presidential candidate, and his son-in-law Senator Stephen Elkins, former Secretary of War, once playing cards. In the late 1870s, Byrne spent time on a surveying crew with none other than George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr., who, at the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, would unveil the amusement park ride that bears his name, the Ferris Wheel. But perhaps none of his acquaintances was more intriguing than Professor Milton W. Humphreys. Born in Greenbrier County, he studied classics before serving as an artillery sergeant in Bryan's Battery, Virginia Artillery of the Confederate Army. He allegedly created the practice of indirect cannon fire, once famously lobbing a cannonball so precisely it fell straight down a chimney, causing a group of Yankee officers at luncheon considerable discomfort. After the War for Southern Independence, Humphreys was appointed to teach Greek and Latin at Washington College, Lexington, Virginia, by its president, Robert E. Lee. Granted leave, he attained a doctorate in classics from the University of Leipzig in Germany, where he studied under some of the greatest classical scholars of his time, including Georg Curtius and Friedrich Rischel. His career was spent teaching at UVA, Vanderbilt, and even the University of Texas. During this time, he frequently visited family in Sutton, where he spent time fishing and telling yarns with Byrne. Byrne recounts a story of bumping into the elderly professor in the train station in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he inquired whether Byrne was still using the Hellgrammite crawfish combination when fishing on the Elk. I think they were kindred spirits, Byrne and Humphreys, country boys with expansive imaginations, aiming to take on the world, as enthralled by the life of the mind as the divagations of the Elk River itself. A talented writer with a gift for subtle description and gentle irony in the mold of Ambrose Bierce or Garrison Keillor, he published articles in the periodical West Virginia Wildlife, which he later collected and published under the title Tale of the Elk in 1927. Many of his articles had a gentle humor, including my favorite, the tale of the bullfrog and the typewriter in a canoe hurtling through the shoals during a memorable fishing trip in 1894. And although he traveled the full length of the Elk River several times over, fly fishing in the headwaters near Webster Springs or bass fishing where the Elk empties into the Kanawha at Charleston, there was nowhere Byrne loved more than a liminal site known as the End of the World. The End of the World Bend is situated in the center of what was known as the Wilderness between 1850 and the late 1870s, a 40-mile section of the Elk River between Strange Creek in Braxton County and Queen Shoals in Kanawha County. In Tale of the Elk, Byrne explains that the northern area from Sutton to Strange Creek and the southern area from Queen Shoals to Charleston had gradually been inhabited by settlers and developers, but that the area between them did not start to be occupied until well after 1880. The region was poorly surveyed and relatively unknown, a pocket of untouched nature, even in the midst of sparsely populated central West Virginia. It remained relatively unexplored, in spite of having been included in the huge 93,000-acre land grant to one William Wilson as early as 1795. Byrne notes that in 1803, some shoals in the Elk River were cleared of rocks to create channels for easier travel, but these were probably in the southern region between Queen Shoals and Charleston. The end-of-the-world bend and settlement can be found about halfway between the towns of Gassaway and Clay. The channel of the Elk River follows a sharp U-shaped bend, flowing first southwards, then northwards. At the outside of the bend is the lofty end-of-the-world cliff, rising nearly vertically from the river to a summit at 500 feet in height. Byrne himself was fascinated by the cliffs and the roaring creek behind them, known even around 1900 as Jumping Gut Creek. But it was the river itself that he loved, on several occasions claiming that the fishing there was best in all the region. Tale of the Elk is filled with references to 4 to 5 feet long suckers and muskellunge, to be gigged here and elsewhere, as well as the second largest bass he ever caught, which fought so hard it had to be shot with a pistol. There have been two explanations of how the end of the world received its name. Growing up, I heard that Shawnee Indians were responsible for its nomenclature, as if the river disappeared under the cliff, putting an end to further travel, marking the end of the hunting trail. But since Shawnee Indians and other groups ceased hunting in the region in the late 1700s, it's unlikely that any later European settlers would have learned the name from them. A more plausible explanation has to do with the hazards of canoeing and rafting around the bend, before and after the initial settlement of the area. Early in Tale of the Elk, Byrne describes the average Elk River canoe as a short, heavy, clubby dugout, made from a poplar log, only 16 to 20 feet in length. Such a canoe was not built for long-distance travel, merely river crossings to set across passengers. This would have been the kind of canoe Byrne himself traveled in on numerous occasions. One can only imagine the hazards of standing up in such a craft while gigging, that is, striking fish with a 10 to 18-foot long spear in swift, shallow water, which was Byrne's favorite pastime. One can easily understand why so many 5-foot behemoths would get away. His description of rafting, or log driving, down the Elk is even more harrowing. Logs 4 feet in diameter on average were rolled into deep water, then lashed with saplings held together with wooden pins. Heavy 9-foot-long oars were positioned on a saddle in the middle of the resulting craft. An oarsman will then stand behind the saddle, rowing forward, avoiding rocks and submerged logs that could stop an oar, kick the raft sideways, or knock the oarsman into the water, all of which imperiled the safety of the outfit, which was normally 2 to 5 men on a raft. Byrne describes one expert oarsman, Ballard Goad, who showed him how to get the advantage of the current, especially how to hug the willers, that is, avoid being dashed by the current onto the rocks on the outer curve of a bend in the river. Perhaps that is how the end-of-the-world bend received its name, with the cliff above looming over the prospect of danger for the traveler. In fact, Byrne himself tells one story that helps us to make this connection. Strange Creek was once referred to as Savage Town, where in the 1870s, brothers Jesse and Al Savage found deposits of iron ore and built a charcoal blast furnace to convert the ore into pig iron. A village built up around it, awaiting the arrival of a railroad that materialized too late. Byrne describes a raft of pig iron bound for Charleston, wrecking in the end-of-the-world bend, which might suggest how it received its name. Byrne explains that since such rafts could never be brought back upstream from Charleston, they were sold there to Kanawha salt makers. But when Michigan salt makers dead-rented much of the Kanawha salt works, putting them out of business, the need for such rafts died, and with it any chance that the Savage Town Iron Works would survive. Byrne says that when he first saw it in 1885, it was already a ruin. Byrne first camped at the end of the world in 1880. It was during that time that he met several local personalities, including Mort Frame, a Confederate veteran and Clay County prosecuting attorney who shared several adventures with Byrne. But no one in Tale of the Elk is drawn more vividly than Solomon Nelson, the fiddler of the wilderness, a frontiersman and farmer who owned a cabin below the cliff at the mouth of Jumping Gut Creek. Byrne describes being Old Sol's guest the first time, waiting for dark so that they could gig, by torchlight, a giant pike Byrne had wounded earlier in the day. Nelson regaled him with fiddle tunes such as Flatfoot in the Ashes, Hornio, which is actually an old Scottish tune known as the Broom of the Cowdenose, Sourwood Mountains, Wild Goose, Cumberland Gap, and Forked Deer, named for Fauquier County, Virginia, and my personal favorite, Sugar in the Gourd. About 12 years later, after Nelson's death, Byrne himself bought Old Sol's cabin with some investors, and by 1911 named it the Camp at the End of the World. Old Sol is the conveyor, perhaps even originator, of some local legends I heard growing up. He's the perfect exemplar of an Appalachian storyteller, a man as likely to get involved in events that might lead to a tale as to stitch himself into an existing tale, participating in the repetitions of symbolic time. In my youth, I heard a legend about a southern plantation owner's wife running off with the foreman, being tracked by a posse to the end-of-the-world cliffs, where the foreman was killed and his body hoisted up a pine tree and swung into a cave high in the cliff. This last detail added a trace of reality to the tale, but not much plausibility. Byrne himself has Old Sol tell a more modest story of running away with an Ohio farmer's wife, only to have a posse take her away. But Old Sol's best yarn concerns the famous wild boar of Jumping Gut. Sol refers to the cliffs as the Devil's Backbone, though I was told only the sloping narrow ridge beside the cliffs went by that name. In the hills beyond it, a giant boar, reputedly as big as a calf, made its home, breaking Nelson's fences and killing 2 young piglets and a calf as well. After several attempts to destroy it, in which 2 dogs were killed, Old Sol and his hunting dogs finally cornered the beast. A tangled knot of animals, growling, snarling, and barking, rolled 100 feet into the river, by his account. A frontiersman who wasted nothing, Nelson dragged the carcass of the boar behind his canoe with a grapevine, then bowed its carcass down for soap grease. Nelson made Byrne the boar's skull as a gift, which he displayed on the wall of the camp there after purchasing it. The skull itself disappeared into obscurity once Byrne himself passed away of pneumonia at the camp in 1937. The Elk River today bears little resemblance to that of Byrne's time. In his own time, he complained that people were dynamiting the best fishing holes and blasting for the railroad threw new boulders into the stream. The bulldozing of a state road made the river more accessible, and the completion of the Sutton Dam in 1961 transformed its bed and flow forever. But myth and legend are timeless. In more recent years, a new legend has formed. A tale of railroad wealth buried in a concrete vault under the rocks, covered over by avalanche, and inevitably the only man to know its whereabouts killed in a logging accident. A liminal site such as the end of the world is sure to elicit tales of extraordinary events for generations to come. For instance, fishermen will constantly rediscover the George Webb Rock, where a man of that name used to sit on a rocking chair in mid-stream, smoking his pipe as he caught bass feeding at the base of the shoals during the Depression. The cliffs themselves loomed inscrutably over the valley, watching the change in generations impassively. Foliage makes the size of the cliffs difficult to see in summer. The half-circle of rock at the summit is surrounded by an impenetrable belt of rhododendron. The long arched ridge of the Devil's Backbone, where wide animal tracks once made access easy, is overgrown by mountain laurel and briars. Since Byrne's death, the 4 generations of the Chapman family made its home in the end-of-the-world Bend. Raising 6 children there beside the elk, Chester and June chronicled their family's growth and development with photographs of children and adults alike against the backdrop of the cliffs. In 1973, Chester and his son Jerry accompanied journalist Skip Johnson of the Charleston Gazette and photographer Farrell Friend up to the cliffs and saw the ruins of Byrne's old camp at the mouth of Jumping Gut. Perhaps there is no greater testament to how much Byrne loved the end of the world than the long poem, written in the style of William Cullen Bryant, with which he closed Tale of the Elk. He describes the precipice deep and the caverns deep, the forests, the rocks, and the rills, and the stream that flows by need the mild azure sky of the end of the world, where the sweet eglantine and the wild grape entwine. The poem ends with a line that has brought a tear to the eye of 3 generations of inhabitants of the end-of-the-world settlement. Let me sleep, let me dream, by the murmuring stream, in my camp at the end of the world. This presentation is dedicated to Chester, June, Karen, Judy, and Jerry, who lived and now sleep and dream at the end of the world. Special thanks, with love, go out to Pat and Jean Church. Thank you.
This video was edited by myself, Evan Hutchens, with great love and care.